when you are ready, and we will take it away.
Okay. Give me just a sec.
And we're giving everybody a couple minutes to join on too. So
Okay.
I think if you went to slideshow.
Yeah. I was
Okay.
monkeying with it.
Oh,
Okay.
yes, that's perfect.
All right. You want to give it a few more minutes or shall we start?
Yeah, we'll give it a few more minutes. And if you don't mind, we can stop the video stop the slide for now. And then I'll do an introduction and everything, and then we can put it back up there.
Got it.
Perfect. All right. See a lot of people joining on. Thank you all so much for joining. Yes, we are. Everyone is muted. So this will be recorded. And so to protect your privacy and to make sure that everyone feels happy and comfortable not having to look like an adult at 8 o'clock at night, the videos are off and you're muted, but we encourage you all to use that chat to put in your reflections, your thoughts, your comments, or what you like, what you don't like. And also use the Q&A because we'll have time at the end for me to ask Dr. Paul some questions. And so you can put in your question, you can upvote someone else's question so that it shows up at the top. We're really hoping to keep the chat and the Q&A really fluid, more like a dialogue in there. But yeah, so don't worry about saying anything in the background. We can't hear you. If lucky out for you all, my kids are downstairs. Otherwise, you would want me to be a participant too because they're loud. But okay, so I'll go ahead and kick us off. My name is Deanna Kalala. I am a reformed attorney turned stay-at-home mom, and I'm now also the chair of the community committee for the board of the NODCC. And I am so thrilled and honored and excited to be presenting to you all this new Connect and Reflect series. The goal of the series was really to have the opportunity to connect NODCC with all of you more often than just that one wonderful conference that we have every other year. And so we'll be talking to experts that will give you practical advice. They'll give you information about what's going on and the research that they're doing and the studies that they're conducting. And, you know, we welcome the feedback and thoughts from you all as we go through this process as well, because we want to talk about the things that are important to you. I do have to say this is our very first time doing this series. So if there are any technical issues or glitches, please blame our minds and not our hearts. And if there are any things that you wish you would have seen or that you're looking forward to, please use the chat, reach out to us and let us know. We definitely want to make sure that this is relevant and helpful to you. So the structure of the call today will be first Dr. Paul giving us a wonderful presentation to really explore the topic that we have at hand today. And then we'll have some time afterwards for Q&A. So if you look down at the bottom of your screen for all the webinar participants, you'll see there's the chat button and there's the Q&A button. I'll keep an eye on both of them. Please, throughout her presentation, throughout the entire time that we're talking, put your thoughts in there as we go along, and I will do my best to address all of the questions that you all raise. And then I've got some questions myself too that I hope we can get Dr. Paul to touch base on. So I think that is all for what I have to say. I guess the last thing is probably to give a disclaimer for you, Dr. Paul, and for me, that everything that will be said on this webinar is our personal opinion, does not represent the opinions of Caltech or the NODCC. But we are doing this in our hope to share great information with all of you. So let me provide a brief introduction to Dr. Paul, a woman who, especially in this community, probably needs no introduction, but I'll do my best. So Dr. Paul is a California licensed clinical psychologist since 2000. She received her PhD in clinical psychology from Fuller Graduate School of Psychology and completed a postdoctoral fellowship in clinical neuropsychology from the Department of Neurology in UCLA. Dr. Paul's research is broadly focused on understanding the role that cortical connectivity plays in development of higher order social cognition and the brain's capacity for reorganization during development. Dr. Paul's work aims to understand how brain structure and function are adapted to compensate for developmental and acquired brain lesions, what limitations remain in spite of these adaptations, and how these factors in combination may contribute to long-term deficits in learning, social cognition, emotional processing, and long-term adaptive functioning. She has ongoing neural imaging and behavioral study. So if you have children or people that you know who would like to be in a study, please reach out to her. And the studies cover several unique populations, notably people with congenital malformations of the corpus callosum, e.g. agenesis of the corpus callosum or dysgenesis of the corpus callosum, and adults with autism spectrum disorder, which makes her the perfect person to talk about this topic tonight. She is currently conducting the first prospective longitudinal study of infants with callosal agenesis funded by the National Institute of Health. Dr. Paul is also the founding president of the International Research Consortium for the Corpus Callosum and Cerebral Connectivity, also known as IRC5, which is a multidisciplinary collaborative effort to understand the causes, consequences, and effective interventions of disorders of the corpus callosum and associated disorders of cerebral connectivity. So without further ado, I turn it over to you, Dr. Paul, to guide us through this discussion today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It is, as always, a delight to be here. And let me see. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes, we see it. You're good to
go. Okay, good. All right. Automatically playing. That's not what I wanted to do. Let's try this again. Apologies. Hopefully that will do what it's supposed to. Thank you for the introduction, and I'm sure many of you know me, and I know many of you. As you all know, I've been around since the NODCC started, and have been studying these conditions for 30 years now. And I am delighted to represent both the NODCC and the IRC5. The IRC5 is a group of researchers who are trying to understand these disorders, these diagnoses, what causes them, what are the consequences, and trying to work with the family organizations to help all of you. So we were really excited. You're going to have multiple speakers over the next several months that are people from the IRC5 that are also very involved in the family organizations around the world. To kick off this new series, we're talking about a topic that has really been confusing for a lot of people, and it's really critical to your day-to-day life. So I'm not going to answer all the questions about this, but I'm going to try to give you an overview of how to think about this topic of how do we understand disorders of the corpus callosum or corpus callosum dysgenesis and these psychiatric or developmental diagnoses. So I want you to take a second and look at these pictures and think about what symptom would result from all of these things. What symptom would they share? And in case you can't see, you've got somebody with a boot on their leg, like a broken ankle, got a messed up hip, some blisters from some ridiculously high heel shoes. This person's got a prosthetic leg, and this is representing someone with a stroke. So this is all of these folks might limp. They probably have some walking problems. So in one way, you could say they all have the same behavior. They all have the same problem. They have the same diagnosis. They're limping. But would you say they have the same diagnosis? Well, no. I mean, the difference between having a blister and having a stroke is pretty dramatic, right? And what you're going to treat and how you would approach the problem is very different. Also, the implications are very different. If it is a blister or even perhaps a broken bone, you don't expect it to last forever. There's healing that will happen, and hopefully the limp will go away. If somebody's had a stroke and it's a brain problem that's causing the limp, then they're much less likely to have it go away. Same with the prosthetic leg. And I bring this example up because this is what we're going to talk about in terms of understanding the distinction and the relationship between ACC or DCC and these psychiatric behavioral diagnoses. So before we get going, many of you have seen this before. I know that terminology gets confusing here, and we've used different acronyms. DCC is what we've used as disorders of the corpus callosum. We've also used it to refer to dysgenesis of the corpus callosum. And sometimes you'll hear CCD, so corpus callosum dysgenesis. It's the same thing, just depends on how you order the words. Dysgenesis means that it didn't develop correctly. And agenesis means it didn't develop at all, so it's absent. Pictures to your right, you'll see a normal brain, and the corpus callosum is outlined in orange, and a hypoplastic corpus callosum right below it, where you can just see a little thin corpus callosum. So that's dysgenesis. It didn't develop correctly, but it's there front to back. It's just not quite right. Complete absence, or agenesis, is the picture that I just put up, and you'll see there's not a corpus callosum at all in the middle there. There's none of that bright white kind of C-shaped structure. And then this is partial absence, or also sometimes called hypogenesis. You can see around that orange little line is showing the little part of the corpus callosum that's there. These are anatomic diagnoses. We finally have a diagnostic code just within the last decade. We finally have a diagnostic code in the international medical diagnostics manuals for corpus callosum malformations. And our estimate is about 1 in 2,000 individuals have a corpus callosum malformation from birth. And that's what we're focused on. So I will probably call it DCC for today. But if I switch and say ACC, I mean the same thing. It is somebody who is born with a malformation of the corpus callosum. And as I said, this is an anatomic diagnosis. My work for the last 30 years, working with Warren Brown, has been trying to understand what are the behavioral consequences of not having a corpus callosum. And our work was rooted in work that Dr. Brown was doing previously, and the more fundamental question of what do you need a corpus callosum for? Like, what's its purpose? And those of you who remember the split brain studies, you may have learned about these in college. There are people that had the corpus callosum cut, and they had this unusual pattern, and we learned that the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere of the brain tend to do different, or be responsible for different activities. And that was revolutionary to our understanding of how the brain works. Well, does that mean that if you're born without a corpus callosum, the same thing happens? That's been our question. What if you're born without a corpus callosum? What are the behavioral consequences? To study that, Dr. Brown and I have focused on what we call primary ACC. So these are people that are born without the corpus callosum, so no corpus callosum at all. And they don't appear to have any other major brain malformation. Their general intelligence is within normal range. So there's not a clear indication that there's some other kind of minor hidden malformations in the brain. So the brain itself, all the other parts appear to be working. They're just missing the corpus callosum. The reason we studied that is so that we could try to isolate what part of this behavioral symptom is due to the absence of the corpus callosum. So we've studied a bunch of people. And from that, we went from the anatomy, DCC, to what we believe is the behavioral syndrome that results from primary ACC. And many of you have heard us talk about this over the last several years. The main symptoms that we're aware of are that even though the corpus callosum, even though you can get information from between the hemispheres, transfers more effectively than it would if you had the split brain surgery, it's still not as effective as if you had a corpus callosum. So you're missing this huge structure. Information doesn't get back and forth as effectively as it would have if you had it. That also means that everything else, all the other activity of the brain tends to be a little bit slow, all that higher level thinking. And that when you have multiple things going on at once, or different types of tasks, or something totally new, a brain without a corpus callosum can get overwhelmed pretty easily and struggle a little bit with that new task. Those core deficits then have secondary impacts. So it might impact how you learn. It might impact retrieval of memories. It impacts ability to process and make sense of non-literal language like prosody or vocal inflection. Imagination and creativity seem to be an issue. They're also, we found, very common in ACC, primary ACC, are difficulties with social communication and processing emotions and inferring what other people intend, their mental states. So we started with this anatomic symptom and have looked for what is shared behaviorally. And part of what we found, it's kind of fascinating, is that, I think I've got my little circles mixed up here. This blue circle should actually go with the very bottom set of symptoms here. The difficulties with reciprocal social interaction and emotion processing are actually very similar to a diagnosis, a psychiatric diagnosis called autism. So let's take a second and back up and talk about neurodevelopmental or psychiatric diagnoses. So setting aside ACC, neurodevelopmental diagnosis or a behavioral diagnosis or psychiatric, they're all ways of describing it's a developmental diagnosis. It starts during the development of the person and it negatively impacts their developmental process, their ability to learn life skills or basic milestones. And it is a diagnosis that is based on behavioral symptoms and on the way the behavioral symptoms show up. It is not based on your brain. It is not based on the anatomy. So if we go back to our first slide, these behavioral diagnoses, the behavioral symptom that people share. So intellectual disability, general difficulties in cognitive or lower cognitive function. Well, you might have that because you had a head injury, you might have as a baby, or because everybody in your family is just a little bit slower, or because there are lots of different reasons, but intellectual disability is one of the diagnoses. Learning difficulties, autism, attention deficit disorder, all of these are diagnoses that we call behavioral or neurodevelopmental diagnoses. So when we start talking about these conditions, we're talking about the behavior, and the researchers who study autism, and I'm one of those, we start with people that have this behavioral profile and try to understand what causes that behavior. What brain areas are involved? How are they functioning differently? Are there different types, variations of this diagnosis that are related to different brain systems? So in a way, my work goes, the ACC side is looking at anatomy to behavior, and my autism work is looking at behavior to anatomy. And one of the things that is important to understand is that these behavioral syndromes, even though we have lots of reason to believe that, yes, if they tend to, these behaviors cluster together and they develop in this order and they tend to happen in a way that makes you think this is some syndrome that is common. I mean, it's not like, oh, you're limping and it could be all these different reasons. It's limping that also comes with the weak arm and the face drooping and some cognitive changes. Well, then you know it's probably stroke, right? So it's how it all goes together, gives you an idea of what caused it. But something like autism, we've come to realize, probably has multiple causes. And there are kind of variations of autism. And so this quote from Dan Geschwin, and I think it's Paul Levitt at UCLA, is the idea that I just wanted to raise the idea that when we talk about autism or ADHD, we're talking about a variety of conditions. It's not a very, the definition is not as clear as we might like. And one other comment I want to make here is that there's work going on that's looking at autism and other developmental conditions like Fragile X and Down syndrome, which are conditions that are clearly genetic, where we then looked at brain malformations or brain structure. And the corpus callosum looks like, in a lot of these people, it's abnormal. So, we know that not everybody with ACC has autism, and not everybody with autism has a malformed corpus callosum, but they seem to be associated. And it can get really confusing. And I've had families say, well, the school won't acknowledge an autism diagnosis because they have ACC. Well, I think we're talking about different things. So I'm going to pull back and say, what matters? What's the purpose of this diagnosis, the diagnosis that you're talking about? And Fragile X or Down syndrome are diagnosed by their genes. But we have some idea of what those genes do as far as how they impact the molecules and the cells and the brain circuits and the behavior. Our diagnosis, agenesis, is more of a circuit, or it's a cellular diagnosis that then has a variety of different genetic causes and has some variety in its behavioral outcomes. So the point at which we're diagnosing impacts the diagnosis. It also impacts what we get from the diagnosis. So a lot of people ask me, what of my child's behavior or my behavior is due to having ACC, and what's due to them being difficult or being 16 or being 3, or we kind of want an explanation. What is this behavior? What's causing this? And ACC can provide some explanation sometimes. The real benefit of an explanation is that it helps us predict. The same for autism. If we say this child's behavior fits the profile of autism, then we can kind of predict what might happen next, or what other challenges they may have, or how they might learn best. So a diagnosis is attempting, whether it's an anatomic diagnosis or behavior diagnosis, to give us some kind of explanation of what's happening, predict what might happen, provide some guidance about how to prevent other problems. I mean, if we go back to the blisters on your foot, you could prevent back problems by recognizing, oh, I've got blisters. I need to be careful how I walk so that I don't throw my back out, so that I don't end up with all these other problems. With ACC or with autism, we know people can end up socially isolated. So how do we prevent some of the social isolation that comes secondary to having this condition? And then lastly is, I think the diagnosis helps us with planning. So preventing other problems, but also planning what assistance may be needed in the future, what treatments do we want to try, how do we optimize the skills that are available. So when you start talking about the relationship between these psychiatric diagnoses or neurodevelopmental diagnoses and ACC, I want you to think about, what's the purpose of this diagnosis? Okay. So we tend to think of, shift a little bit more. I'm giving you some structures to think about all of these questions. I hear families say, I worry about giving a label to the child of autism or ADHD because it puts them in a box. And in some ways it does. It says, we expect this to happen. We expect these symptoms. But it also is a way of, like I said, predicting, planning, etc. And a question that comes up often is ACC, is it a disability? It's just the way somebody is. I think key to thinking of, to understanding what a disability is that it, as a psychologist, I think of it as an atypical behavior or an atypical syndrome, so deviance. But, Einstein was deviant. He was not normal. Do we think he was disabled? No. Are we thankful he was alive? Yes. So being atypical in and of itself is not a problem. If it's dysfunctional, so it's interfering with your ability to do the things you need to do to live, well, that's more, and it's atypical, well, then we start to think, well, this might be something we'd call a disability. And if it's distressing. So there are people with autism that say, I'm socially isolated. I'm fine with that. It causes me no problems. I held a job. Well, then I don't know if it's a disability. It's their way of living in the world. So again, thinking about your child and what diagnosis they have, I want you to think about these diagnoses in context. I'm going to give you another example. This little boy, anybody notice anything unusual about him? He doesn't have any feet. Now, looks like he's probably 1.5. How many 1-year-olds, 1.5, if you can't walk or you're pretty unsteady on your feet, is that deviant? Is that atypical? No, it's normal for that age. Are you expected to be able to walk? Not really. You function like any other little kid. You can play, you can crawl, you get carried a lot. It's probably not interfering with life too much at that point. As a teenager, it might be an issue. And this person, you may recognize, is Oscar Pistorius. So once this young man, who's very smart and very physically talented, got these super fancy legs, prostheses, he became an Olympian. Well, heaven knows he's way more able than I am when it comes to running. I would not call him disabled, right? He's got money and this great life and physical health, and he's had to compensate for a challenge, but it's working. So again, it may not be a disability. Well, this is Oscar Pistorius in court. And if you recall, he was incarcerated for a crime. And if you take away his prostheses and you put him in prison, or he's got to potentially defend himself, and well, then maybe his disability is more of a disability. The reason I gave this example is because it points out that the limitation itself is not what defines whether it is a disability or not. It's how it's functioning at that time in life, in those circumstances, and with the structures around it. So for Oscar Pistorius, he, even in prison, may be doing great. But you throw on one of these other things that we talked about at the beginning. If his hip goes out, if he has a stroke, if he's got blisters on his stumps, he may have a lot bigger, those things may have a bigger impact on him. They're a separate problem, but the impact of them may be even greater because of the underlying condition or the existing condition. Now I'm going to put this in the ACC rule. Let's say instead of missing feet, you've got somebody who's missing a corpus callosum. And as an infant, they're cruising along, things are going well. Maybe even, you get a lot of support around it, things are okay in a lot of life. But then under certain circumstances, under a lot of stress, they start to have a lot more problems. Then you might have what ends up being some kind of psychiatric distress, depression, anxiety, other conditions that emerge because of the circumstances and the combined with the ACC diagnosis. In children, one of the things we're concerned about is, do they have an additional diagnosis? So in this example, it would be the hip problem, let's say. Well, I know a few people with ACC that not only have ACC, and that means that sometimes they don't keep up and they look inattentive, but these kids also seriously have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and would have had that whether they had ACC or not. Then you've got a combination of two things, as opposed to somebody who has attention problems because of ACC. So I hope you're starting to see that they're interrelated, and the behavioral manifestations of ACC may vary if you've got some other diagnosis that would have been there anyway, or it may be that developmentally it looks kind of like this other neurodevelopmental disorder. And whether or not you want to accept getting a secondary diagnosis of attention deficit disorder or autism or intellectual disability, I think depends on whether or not the behaviors are there. If the person is showing that constellation of behaviors, then this neurodevelopmental diagnosis or this psychiatric diagnosis of depression or anxiety is just describing the behavior. It's not an anatomic thing. It's not something you can hold, and it may even change, but it is describing what's going on. And in that way, autism diagnosis, learning disorder diagnosis, it may be very useful because it allows us to predict what might come next, plan, and prevent other problems. And until we have a clearer understanding of what ACC, we have the general syndrome, but it varies a lot, and we don't have any treatment specific for ACC. So for now, we've got to depend on treating the symptoms that we see, whether the cause is a broken ankle or it's blisters. You still may need a cane to treat the limp. So that's kind of my big thinking on all of this. I'm excited to hear your questions and your thoughts. I also wanted to end by just commenting again how much I respect the family organizations, Corpal, OSTOC, NODCC, the Brazilian group. There's a French group, there's an Italian group, I think there's a Hungarian group. And it's just, we learned so much from interacting with the families. So I appreciate all of your impact or your input. And if you are interested in participating in research, we are doing studies from birth all the way into adulthood. So if you go to the accinfantstudy.com website and look at ACC studies, you'll see where to get more information about different types, infant, child, and adult studies. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Paul, for taking the time to really parse out all of that information. I think for a lot of us, we get the ACC diagnosis first, and then, heads down, focused on that, and, a lot of times we don't make a space to think about these other co-occurring conditions. And so I think the first question that I asked, and I know you mentioned that a lot of parents ask you this question, but I don't think I heard an answer. So I'm going to ask it again. How should parents or people with ACC themselves differentiate between, or, what kind of symptoms, what kind of things can they look for to help them differentiate between ACC versus autism versus ADHD and so on and so forth? Obviously, you talked about how it's compounding in a lot of different ways, but is there some way where you can say, okay, I know my child has ACC, but they also have X, Y, or Z?
And that's where I think that's where a good assessment is really critical. Because somebody who has seen a lot of neurodevelopmental diagnoses, and especially somebody who does neurocognitive assessment, is going to be looking for certain patterns that are clearly attention deficit disorder, or clearly autism, or clearly associated with a particular learning disability. And it may overlap, and it may look very similar at some point in a child's development and then shift a little, or it may have started at a different time, which would suggest to the person doing the diagnosis that, oh, it's probably not, typical autism, but it looks like autism probably resulting from the ACC, or it looks like attentional problems because of the slow processing speed, but it doesn't quite fit with attention deficit disorder. And so that's where it's complicated, and the differential diagnosis is hard. And that's where a neuropsychological assessment is really critical. Does that help? I mean, it isn't easy to distinguish if it's either or both and. But the one thing you know is you do have ACC, whether you have the other or not.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that parental or internal, if you're the person with ACC intuition, is probably very helpful too, because even for doctors and nurses, or all of the practitioners who are doing those diagnoses, they can too get focused on ACC. Oh, this is an ACC problem, and overlook the additional diagnoses. So I would say if you
and like I said, great, we have an ACC diagnosis, but that doesn't help with a reading problem. And reading is a great example that a lot of people with ACC are delayed in reading, but they don't have a reading disability. They just have a general disability or delay in learning new things. So they might need reading intervention for a little while and then overcome their quote unquote reading disability. But for that year or two, that diagnosis is what's going to get them the help they need to overcome this hurdle. So,
and you've answered. Oh, go ahead. I was just saying you answered one of the parents' questions in there, so that's great. Another question that Katie Worka asked is similarly, she's saying that her son, who's 4, who has PACC, has mild to moderate ASD and ADHD symptoms, but is also very advanced in reading and math. And she asks, are advanced behaviors like hyperlexia also associated with ACC?
It's a great question. I can think of a few examples of people that have had advanced skills and have ACC. This is where I'm going to do my plug for research. We need you to participate. We need everybody, whether your child's doing really well or really poorly, we need everybody to participate in these studies, fill out the questionnaires online so that we have a better understanding of the whole range. Because right now, I mean, this is the first time we've ever done this kind of large scale study.
Yeah.
So you ask a question like that without everybody participating, we don't know what's typical.
That is a great kick in the butt for all of us to look for ways that we can participate in the research and learning that you all are doing. Another question that was asked from Jody Jacobson is whether or not they're finding that the malformations in the corpus callosum are genetically passed down.
Yes and no. They're in people that have ACC and other brain malformations. There's a higher percentage that have a genetic cause has been identified. In people with isolated ACC, it's less than half. And one thing I want to make clear is when we talk about a genetic diagnosis, there's a difference between the genetics that are heritable, that we pass down from generation to generation, and genetic changes that happen spontaneously in an individual. So just because somebody may have some indication what gene was involved, doesn't mean that they got it from their parent. And again, we're making some progress in understanding that, but participating in the genetic studies is another really important component to us being able to figure this out. And I hope that you all picked up on my oval with the different points of levels of what's important, because one of my questions is, if we're going to predict behavior, what predicts outcomes in ACC the best? Is it the brain scan? Is it the genetic diagnosis? Is it what information is going to give us the most bang for our buck in being able to predict outcome? And the only way we can figure that out is to have as many people as possible participate so that we can see the relationship in a lot of people between genes, brain anatomy and behavior.
Yeah. We have another question from Dana Kiesel. She said that they got their ACC diagnosis last because her son was diagnosed, I guess, with ACC at 29. There's a lot of acronyms in here. Hopefully you know what they mean because I don't. She said we had ADHD and NLD as the LD. So hopefully that makes sense to
Yes.
you. And also there were some spectrum issues. And I think this last part is really a great question. Does it really matter in the end, or do you just treat the symptoms?
It's an excellent question. And I think for these days, so many people are diagnosed prenatally. So you get ACC early. And older kids and adults, it was much more common that they were trying to diagnose the behaviors. And the reason you probably had ADHD and some autism symptoms and some learning disability and nonverbal learning disorder is because it didn't quite fit any of them, right? It had it. And so there's always, parents will say, they're just something's off, but we can't quite figure out, or it looks like this. And then a few years later, it looks more like this.
Mm-hmm.
And so I encourage you not to get too attached to any one of those behavioral diagnoses, unless it is clearly a secondary diagnosis. But just view it as this is what's describing the behavior right now. And this is what we can work on and move toward addressing. And that's why the behavioral diagnosis may look like it changes and whatever. It's not that the doctors don't know what they're talking about or they're crazy. It's because this, in some cases, it really is ACC driven behavioral issues.
And that's really helpful for what you talked about in terms of not getting caught up in the labels, because it sounds like they may change from year to year. So very, very helpful feedback. We've got another question from Melinda Humbert, who asked, she said, I know researchers are generally seeking to be open and unbiased, but I am also wondering what applications or hope you have for the impact of the research. And I think that's such a positive question to ask, and one I have myself. So what hopeful stories or feedback or goals for the research do you have?
One of the most powerful moments for me in this career was talking with a business person, trying to get him to give us money, basically. And the business person wanted to know what's the cure, and why would I give you money if there's not a cure? And thankfully, I had brought along a mom and a 10-year-old girl. And the 10-year-old girl was drawing flowers and writing chlorophyll on the whiteboard and just showing off and being very cute and smart. But the mom said, oh, if I didn't know what was wrong, or what was causing her behavior, I would be parenting her very differently. And the way I would be parenting would be causing more problems.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what I've seen, and this is, maybe it's me just trying to have hope, the families who I've watched their kids grow up the last 20 years have grown up with information about what we've learned. And so parents have been able to approach parenting with an understanding of these core syndrome issues and how to parent and how to monitor energy levels and encourage the best functioning possible, understanding ACC. And those young adults are showing some great success. They manage their own symptoms. They're not intimidated by having those symptoms. Whereas some of the adults that found out as adults that they had it, no one ever explained to them what was wrong. Nobody knew. So their struggles were a lot bigger and a lot more complicated because people treated them differently and expected things of them that they couldn't do without assistance. So I think understanding and being able to predict effectively is going to help families parent effectively and create more stability throughout people's lives. I mean, we all have disabilities. We all have things we're not good at. We have to learn what they are and manage them.
Yeah. And I know for new parents, especially, just wondering what's going to happen. When will I know how life will be for my child is the biggest question that, I don't think any parent can answer, but I think we ask a lot more when the child has ACC, right? Or any other disability. I want to turn to a question from, go ahead.
And I think the other thing is for families to know, I have a child that may be doing well, but they're doing it differently, knowing that they're working harder, knowing that, oh, I can probably expect that adolescence is going to take a lot longer. Then you can even be planning out your family life with expectations that are more realistic and minimize some of the frustration and the conflict down the line, because you don't hit 20 and the adult with ACC expects to be functioning at 20 and the parent expects them to be functioning at 20. They know, oh no, we got another 5 to 10 years here. We're working on this. So it gives you the information you need to pace yourself and manage life.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to turn to a question from Tammy Black. She says, when I last researched coping methods for ACC and ADHD or autism, mindfulness, CBT, DBT was suggested as a behavioral therapy to pursue. If the above is accurate and relevant to this conversation, can you please speak to how those coping methods bridge all of the diagnoses discussed tonight?
Again, great question. I think that the things that I believe from working with a whole range of ages of people with ACC is therapeutically, the aim is less about insight and more about strategy. And so cognitive behavioral therapy can end up a little bit insight oriented, but it also can be very much just learning, when this happens, this triggers me, and this is what I do, and this is how I manage those behaviors. And so it's learning systems to manage your own behavior. Dialectical behavioral therapy does the same kind of thing, but focuses on emotion regulation. And a lot of people with ACC have difficulty managing their internal experience. Emotions get really big, and they do for all children and adolescents, but it just kind of continues on into adulthood and sometimes can cause a lot of other problems. So learning to regulate your emotions and treat them respectfully and manage your energy is a key component of having ACC. And I think that those relate to the ADHD symptoms, the autism symptoms, but it's that arousal regulation that DBT is getting at that is really effective and important. And it also then helps with social issues. Because if you're emotionally unregulated, and it's fine when you're 3, but at 10, causes problems.
Yeah. You touched on this a little bit in your presentation, but there's a question here from Aaron Higgins. She asked, I just lost it. Here we go. Dr. Paul, do you have any sense of the relative prevalence of psychiatric disorders among individuals with DCC? Which disorders are most common? ASD, ADHD, anxiety, depression?
Autism is the one that we've done the most systematic characterization of, I think. And the studies, I looked at adults. Dr. Scher's lab looked at children. I did some work with children, and now we're looking at infants. And even in our infants, we just looked at this last week. It's still coming out about a third are looking like they meet criteria for autism. And what's fascinating, and one of the things I'm excited about with the infant study, is because we can diagnose it at birth, we can track these kids and we'll get a better understanding of, is there something unique about the kids that truly develop autism symptoms versus those kids with ACC that go through periods of social difficulties. And we're directly comparing them. And we'll talk about this next week at our session about direct comparison with kids that truly just have autism and don't have ACC. That kind of research is also helping us differentiate between the diagnoses and the overlap. So that's critical for clarifying.
And I've got a question from Marissa Renden here. She says that her son is 19 with complete ACC, and they're waiting for an autism diagnosis. And I think this is a great question for everyone. She asks, to advocate for my son in this process, are there any questions or suggestions that you have for her? So she doesn't have that autism diagnosis yet, but she suspects it. What can she do to help people differentiate between ACC and autism?
Again, you said differentiate, and I don't differentiate's not the word you want.
Well, and her question was like, just generally, what
Right.
are her questions and what questions and suggestions should she ask during this?
But I'm just pointing it out. It's so
she's
easy
going in for the diagnosis. Yeah.
It's so easy to get into that.
Yeah.
And the key is, how do you, I think it's just focusing on the autism diagnosed symptoms and how this individual meets them. And it may be that some of the adults, we have this new diagnosis, it's a social communication disorder, which is not quite autism. So that might fit a little better if it's about the social communication and it doesn't have some of the other behaviors. I don't know that, I think focusing on the difficulty of inferring other people's thoughts and feelings, that theory of mind, predicting, those tend to be symptoms that are clearly autistic and are common in ACC.
And I know you've got a hard stop, so I'm going to share the last question for tonight, which will be from Melinda Humbert. She asks, what, if any, research threads exist looking at DCC and gifted intelligence?
Sorry, I'm going to just keep saying the same thing. Yeah. I mean, actually today I was thinking, man, I really want to start a study that looks at aging in ACC. Yeah. And I mean, there's so many questions, and the only way we can answer them is by people participating in the studies and getting a more representative sample. So, I mean, I will brag and say I'm really proud of the fact that we're almost up to 500 people in our infant and child studies. And some of you have done one time point and then kind of fell off and some haven't even enrolled. We're going to share all of your data with other researchers. Other people will be able to mine it. We're going to compare it with other groups, autism, Fragile X, Down syndrome. I mean, I'll tell you next week. I'm excited and proud of how we've tried to structure it so that we use our resources as effectively as possible. But there are just so many questions I can't answer because we don't have the information. So yeah, I'd love to hear more about the gifted. I mean, they're anecdotes, but
yeah. So I will ask Barb if you can put the links to Dr. Paul's studies and the website into the chat so everyone can see it. That would be awesome. Guys, I tried to answer as many questions as I could. If I couldn't get to yours, I'm so sorry, but please put your questions in the chat. This auto recording will be available. We'll try and follow up either in other webinars or other conversations to address the questions that were not answered here. Please put your comments and feedback in the chat. Like I said, this is our first time doing it. So The more feedback you give us, the better we will be able to tailor this to what you're interested in. Dr. Paul, if you need to drop, that's okay, but I do have a couple announcements as well that I want to share with the group. Take a couple minutes. So we have these Connect and Reflect series webinars, and in this part, we're talking with the experts. But you know who else is an expert? All of you. The questions that you had, the comments that you had in this chat show the depth of knowledge that you have about yourself or your loved one that's dealing with ACC. And we explore the conversations that and the thoughts and the expertise that all of you bring in our monthly recurring calls. So just to let you all know, on October 14th, we have a call for newborns and expectant parents. I'm sorry, on October 12th, newborns and expectant parents, October 14th, grandparents, October 24th, mothers, October 28th, fathers, and then we also have adults, siblings, diverse, all sorts of different ways that we're trying to get to talk with all of you. And we will be covering these questions that we talked about and your experiences during each of those calls. So it's a recurring call, but the topic and the discussion is very different each time. Like Dr. Paul alluded to, you can join us again next week. We will be having another conversation specifically focused on autism and DCC and the state of research and where it's going. So it's going to be a very interesting and in-depth conversation. And then I also want to throw out to all of you, if you are interested in being the person behind the scenes that's helping to craft these calls and the discussions and thinking about how to get people together, we are always looking for volunteers on the community committee. And so you can just reach out to community@nodcc.org and you'll get directly to me and I will respond to you within 2 seconds. So don't hesitate to reach out. So I'll leave it open just a little bit more so you guys can keep your comments and your chats and thoughts going in the chat. But thank you all so much for joining. Thanks for taking out the time on the evening. Again, thank you to Dr. Paul for your time. This was incredible, and we look forward to talking to you again next week.
See you then.
All right, y'all have a great evening. Bye-bye.